Blood hadn't been spilled yet, but the flight attendant was already calling security. 10-year-old Nova Green sat frozen in seat 1A, her feet not quite touching the plush carpet. A sketchbook was pressed tightly to her chest, trembling slightly in her arms. "She has a ticket," her mother said calmly. Too calmly. But Chloe, the first-class flight attendant, wasn't listening. "We've got a disruption in row 1. Possible forged documents," she said into the cabin phone, her tone crisp and cool, like reading off a weather delay. 3 rows back, a silver-haired woman in a navy cardigan quietly closed her leather-bound notebook and tapped once. "Tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever seen someone punished just for existing where they belonged." 30 minutes earlier, everything had felt magical. Nova couldn't stop staring out the oval window of the aircraft, watching the other planes move like slow steel birds across the Atlanta tarmac. She'd never flown before, never even been in an airport until today. And now here she was, in first class. Her backpack rested under the wide leather seat, her favorite mechanical pencil tucked behind one ear. She wore her Sunday dress, pale yellow with tiny airplanes stitched along the hem, sewn by hand by her mother the night before. Nova didn't care that it was a little too short. She felt proud, like she'd been invited into the sky, and in a way, she had. Winning the Reading for the Future National Scholarship had changed everything. Her picture had been printed in the Atlanta Tribune, her holding a stack of library books taller than her. The foundation had covered her trip to Boston for the award ceremony, hotel, meals, and even first-class airfare. Nova's plan was to spend the entire flight sketching her dream aircraft, a solar-assisted twin-engine passenger jet with retractable wings. She was going to name it the Dreamline Junior. But instead of sketching, she sat stiffly, her small hands still gripping the armrest long after boarding ended, because something had shifted the moment they stepped onto the plane. Chloe hadn't smiled. Not really. She'd looked at Nova and her mother as if they'd wandered into the wrong restaurant and were too proud to leave. "You're in first class?" Chloe had asked. "Yes, ma'am," Nova's mom said, offering the printed e-tickets. "Seats 1A and 1B. Chloe studied them for a full 5 seconds longer than necessary. "Scholarship?" she asked without being prompted. Nova's mom nodded. "Well, please hurry. Other passengers are waiting." That was the first crack. The second came 10 minutes later when Chloe offered champagne to the businessman in 2C, addressed the older woman in 1C by name, "Ms. DuPont. Lovely to have you again," and entirely skipped Nova and her mom. No welcome, no water, no menu. Nova didn't say anything. She opened her sketchbook instead. She didn't draw right away, though. She was still thinking about how Chloe had glanced at her ID earlier like it might catch fire in her hands. "You okay?" her mom asked in a low voice. Nova nodded, sort of. Then Chloe returned. "Miss Green?" she asked, pretending to struggle with the name. Nova looked up. "Yes, ma'am? I need to see your ticket again." Nova's mom blinked. "She already showed it when we boarded. I need to verify the passenger information." Chloe's smile didn't reach her eyes. Nova dug through her backpack and handed it over again. School ID, ticket, seat assignment. Chloe looked at the student ID and gave a short, bitter laugh. "This could be anything. Don't you have a government-issued photo ID?" "She's 10, her mom said, still measured. "That's what she has." Chloe said. "It's just unusual to see a child in first class without a chaperone." "I'm sitting right next to her," her mom said evenly. Chloe handed the cards back with a clipped, "Very well," and disappeared again. Nova stared down at her lap. She wasn't sketching anymore. Now her fingers just traced the edge of the paper, round and round. She'd done nothing wrong, and yet somehow it felt like she had. 2 minutes later, Chloe was back. "Ladies," she said coolly, "a passenger has reported suspicious behavior in this row." Nova looked around. The cabin was calm. No one looked concerned. No one even looked up. "What behavior?" her mother asked. I'm not at liberty to say, but security has been notified. Please remain in your seats. Then Chloe pressed the intercom. We have a possible issue in 1A. Unconfirmed ID, potential forgery. The words echoed across the cabin. Nova felt her throat tighten. Her mom reached over and squeezed her hand. Stay calm, baby, she whispered. But Nova could see it in her mother's jaw, tight, clenched. She was furious and afraid. Moments later, a tall man with a TSA badge walked onto the plane. Officer Tyler Briggs. He was at least 6'3", wearing mirrored sunglasses indoors. He stopped beside their row. Let me see your documents, again. Nova's mom handed over the printed tickets, the email confirmation, the school ID. Briggs barely glanced. Okay, I'm going to need you two to move to the back of the aircraft. This seat isn't valid. No, her mother said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it landed like stone. She has a valid ticket. She is not moving. I'm not going to argue, Briggs said, looking down at Nova. Stand up, sweetheart. Nova's hands clutched her sketchbook. Now. Nova shook her head. Just once. Briggs reached down and grabbed her arm. Hey, her mom snapped. Don't touch her. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Briggs pulled anyway. Nova's backpack fell. Her sketchbook hit the floor, papers scattering. Drawings, certificates, and one framed photo slipped under the seat. A photo of Nova standing beside a wall of books, holding a ribbon. No one moved, except the silver-haired woman in 1C. She stood slowly, knees cracking. She bent and picked up the photo. Then she looked up at Briggs and Chloe. You've made a serious mistake, she said softly. This doesn't concern you, Briggs barked. The woman ignored him. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a slim leather notebook, opened it, pressed her thumb to a glowing silver seal. Chloe frowned. Ma'am, what are you doing? The woman raised her eyes. Henrietta DuPont, she said quietly. Chloe paled. Wait, the Henrietta? I've just flagged this airline in the AerEthica gateway as non-compliant, Henrietta said. Your operations at 19 federal airports are suspended pending ethics review. Everything stopped. Briggs let go of Nova's arm. The cabin fell deathly silent. Passengers were no longer pretending not to look. Every head turned. Phones rose into recording position. Nova didn't fully understand what had happened, but she saw the look on her mother's face shift, from fear to stunned relief. Henrietta turned to Nova, handed her the photo. You don't need to leave, she said softly. You earned this seat. Nova nodded, silent. And then, for the first time in 20 minutes, she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Henrietta DuPont's name hung in the air like a suspended verdict. Nobody moved, even the businessman in 2C, who hadn't looked up once since boarding, slowly pulled out his phone. Briggs took a cautious step back, then looked at Chloe like she'd set him up. Henrietta didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She had pulled one card, one tap of her fingertip on the AerEthica gateway system, and everything shifted. 19 airports. Grounded. Chloe tried to recover her posture. Ms. DuPont, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I wasn't aware you were on this flight. That much is clear, Henrietta replied, folding the leather cover of her ethics ledger. She turned to Nova. Are you all right, dear? Nova nodded slowly. Her hands were still clutching the sketchbook like it might vanish if she let go. Henrietta's tone softened. What's your name? Nova Green, she whispered. Well, Nova, I think you and I are going to have a very important conversation when we land. Then Henrietta turned to Chloe. Her voice, still calm, sliced cleaner than anything loud ever could. You escalated a situation involving a child, without cause, against policy, and in front of 35 witnesses. And then you involved law enforcement. I followed procedure, Chloe stammered. No, Henrietta said. You followed bias, It didn't take long. By the time the plane was airborne, half the first-class passengers had already uploaded clips of the incident to social media. One of the videos had caught Chloe's voice saying, "Possible forgery," loud and clear. Another had caught Briggs grabbing Nova's arm. Hashtags began circulating before they reached cruising altitude. Had she had a valid ticket? Let Nova sit. Airline of shame. Nova stayed quiet for most of the flight. She didn't eat, didn't sketch, just held her photo and watched clouds pass. Her mom sat beside her, silent too, but alert, protective. Henrietta didn't bother Chloe again. She simply made 3 calls from her seat, spoke softly into her AerEthica tablet, and typed something with quiet precision. Nova couldn't help but glance over once. The screen wasn't filled with flight data or charts. It had people's names, employee IDs, ethics scores. When they landed in Boston, 2 things happened almost immediately. First, Chloe and Briggs were escorted off the plane by 2 waiting security officers in airport uniforms. Second, a tall man in a tailored gray suit and an earpiece approached Nova and her mom before they even reached baggage claim. "Mrs. Green, I'm Stephen York. I'm with the Federal Transportation Ethics Division. Ms. DuPont asked me to personally escort you both to the hospitality lounge. There are some people who would like to speak with you." Nova's mom hesitated. "Are we in trouble?" "Not at all," Stephen smiled. "Actually, quite the opposite." The lounge was nicer than any hotel room Nova had ever been in. Soft gray chairs, cold sparkling water in glass bottles, a view of the runway through floor-to-ceiling windows. Nova sat quietly while Henrietta conferred with a panel of executives, ethics officers, and legal reps. She'd invited several national observers to the meeting, among them a woman from the Department of Education and a black businesswoman from the Children's Aviation Access Council. Nova's case was being framed not just as a violation of airline ethics, but as a case study of systemic patterns across the entire industry. "Let's be clear," Henrietta said. "This is not about one flight attendant. This is about an environment that allowed her actions to feel normal, and a security response that was faster than a meal service." One executive fumbled. "Ms. DuPont, if we may clarify, this was an isolated incident." Henrietta raised a brow. "Was it?" She held up her tablet and tapped it twice. A dashboard appeared on the lounge monitor. Passenger ethics violation logs. Filter, minor, non-white, first class. The numbers lit up like sirens. Over 3,700 flagged complaints in the last 24 months. 94% had been dismissed as misunderstandings. "I authored the Passenger Equity Accord 5 years ago," Henrietta said. "This industry signed it, and now it's being ignored." Back in the corner of the room, Nova leaned into her mom's side. "I didn't mean to get anyone in trouble," she whispered. Her mom stroked her hair. "You didn't. They got themselves in trouble." Nova blinked slowly. "Are we going home?" "Not yet, baby." By that evening, the story had spread beyond travel circles. Cable news hosts were calling it the tap heard round the runway. Editorials exploded. Civil rights attorneys were tagging airlines on Twitter with phrases like, "You'll never ignore the quiet seats again." And, most importantly, Henrietta had triggered something far more permanent than a PR scandal. She had opened an official ethics review across all 61 participating airports under the AerEthica network. 3 airports announced they were suspending cooperation with Liberty Sky Airlines until the matter was resolved. And Henrietta, quietly and without ceremony, downgraded the airline's global ethics compliance score to non-compliant. That single classification froze over $1.1 billion in pending ESG-aligned investments, triggered a default clause on 4 major aviation insurance policies, caused the airline stock to dip 16% in 3 hours. At home in Atlanta, Nova's principal called, then the mayor, then a senior advisor from the U.S. Department of Education. But Nova still didn't fully understand why her name was trending on every platform. All she knew was this: she hadn't done anything wrong. And this time, someone powerful didn't just say it. They acted. 1 week later, Henrietta sent Nova a package. Inside was a handwritten note. Nova, you reminded me why I do what I do. You are dignity in motion. Keep sketching. Keep dreaming. And never let anyone tell you that your seat is borrowed. It's yours. The envelope also contained something else. A laminated card, black and gold, with Nova's name etched across the top. P-E-A-R-L. Access, Identification, Passenger Equity, Accreditation and Respect Ledger. Valid for lifetime, issued by Federal Aviation Ethics Board. It meant Nova could board any U.S. flight, any airline, without question, priority lane, or escort. And no one, ever again, could make her prove she belonged in first class. The morning after the flight, Nova woke up in the hotel suite still fully dressed, her sketchbook clutched like a stuffed animal against her chest. She blinked at the high ceiling, confused for a second. Was it a dream? No. The framed letter from Henrietta DuPont was still sitting on the desk. Her mom stood by the window on the phone, her voice quiet but tight. She hasn't eaten. She's only 10 years old, for God's sake. This shouldn't be her battle. A pause. No, she's not doing press. She's a child, not a statement. Nova sat up slowly, her head heavy. The past 24 hours had been a blur of flash bulbs, escort cars, and grown-ups who said a lot of big words with too many syllables. Ethics, violations, testimonies, compliance networks. None of it felt real. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a little girl who liked planes. She got out of bed and walked to the window. Boston skyline, a foggy outline of Logan Airport in the distance. Her mom hung up. Was that Ms. DuPont again? Nova asked. No, her mom said, turning. It was a reporter. Again. I don't want to talk to anybody. You don't have to. An hour later, they were back at the airport. But not to fly. They were meeting someone. Or rather, everyone. Henrietta had arranged a private roundtable in a conference room near the FAA's Boston headquarters. There were 20 seats. Nova and her mother were escorted into the room through a side door, away from the press outside. Inside the room sat 4 airline CEOs, 3 ethics officers from the AerEthica gateway system, 2 U.S. senators, and Henrietta, of course, calm, poised, taking notes in a leather-bound planner. They all stood when Nova entered. It wasn't a gesture, it was an apology. Senator Klein, a tall man with tired eyes and a deep southern drawl, addressed her gently. Nova, we want to thank you for being here. Nova looked up at her mother, then back at him. I didn't really have a choice, did I? That earned a few soft chuckles. Henrietta smiled. You're right, she said. You didn't. But now that you're here, you're going to help us fix something broken. The meeting wasn't performative. They went deep. Henrietta projected a report onto the screen. A cross-airline analysis of racial bias reports, child profiling, and uneven service records. Nova sat in silence for most of it, until Senator Klein asked her directly, Nova, can you tell us how it felt when the flight attendant told you to stand up? Nova's grip on her sketchbook tightened. She didn't ask me, she told me, Nova said. Like I didn't belong there. Like it was wrong to be me. No one interrupted. She took a breath. She said something about forgery, like I stole the seat. But I won it. I worked hard. I drew blueprints. I read 10 books a week. That seat was mine. Do you think this happens a lot to kids like you? Another senator asked gently. Nova nodded. But they don't always have someone like Ms. DuPont to say something. Henrietta leaned forward. That's why we're creating something new today. The presentation that followed was historic. Henrietta unveiled a new ethics protocol called CREW, Child Rights in Every Wing. It mandated that all airline staff be trained to identify and prevent discriminatory bias toward minors. Passenger identity protocols be redesigned for children without government IDs. A new federal hotline be created specifically for child travelers to report abuse or bias. Each airport must designate at least one passenger integrity officer to respond to real-time incidents. And here's the part that made Nova's jaw drop. The program would be named after her, not in a flashy, look-at-me way, but in a quiet, permanent way. The Nova Green Protocol, a new baseline for how airlines would treat all child passengers with fairness, dignity, and clarity. "Do I have to do anything?" Nova asked after the meeting ended. "No," Henrietta said softly. "You've already done it." That night, after all the cameras had been turned off and the applause had faded, Nova and her mom sat at a small diner near the hotel. Nova picked at her pancakes. Her mom looked tired, but proud. "You okay?" Nova nodded slowly. "I still feel like I'm dreaming." Her mom smiled. "Good dreams don't shake the country, baby." Nova frowned. "I didn't mean to shake anything." "I know, but sometimes the right person in the wrong moment changes everything." At that very hour, across the country, Liberty Sky's CEO issued a public resignation. The FAA announced an emergency review of all complaints involving minors in premium seating. 3 other airlines preemptively requested to adopt the Nova Green Protocol voluntarily, and Nova's story was featured on every major evening news broadcast. Not because she made noise, but because she didn't. Because she stayed seated, silently, while everything around her tried to push her out. 2 days later, a handwritten letter arrived at their hotel suite. It wasn't from a senator or a CEO. It was from a girl in Omaha, Nebraska. "Dear Nova, my name is Kenna. I'm 11. Last year, I flew to visit my dad. I sat in first class with my grandma's upgrade. A flight attendant told me, 'Are you lost?' I didn't say anything. I just went to economy. When I saw your video, I cried. I didn't know we were allowed to stay. Thank you for staying. Love, Kenna." Nova read the letter twice. Then she read it out loud. And then she cried too. But not because she was sad, because for the first time she understood that her quiet had made noise for someone else. Nova didn't return to school that week, not because she was scared, but because her name had stopped being just hers. The principal had called. "Nova's presence is distracting the class," he said carefully. "We support her completely, but the media attention, the interviews, the social media tags, she's 10, her mother cut in. "This isn't her fault." "I understand, but perhaps a few days of independent study would help." Translation: "Keep your daughter out of sight until people forget what she did." So Nova stayed home. Her sketchbooks were full, her eyes were tired, and Henrietta had asked her to rest while the grown-ups took care of things. But Nova couldn't rest. She couldn't stop thinking about all the Kennas out there. Kids who quietly took abuse and walked back to economy because they thought they didn't belong in the front. That night, Nova opened her old Lego set and started rebuilding her plane. Only this time, she made one small change. She added a tiny brown Lego girl in the pilot seat, just to see what it looked like. The next morning, her mom got an email. Subject line: "Urgent. Liberty Sky legal threat." Nova wasn't supposed to see it, but she did. The airline was pushing back hard against the FAA and AerEthica Gateway for the unwarranted ethics downgrade. They claimed Nova's case had been sensationalized, and that their internal investigation found no misconduct. Worse, they were threatening to sue Henrietta personally for defamation and financial sabotage. Nova's heart thudded. "They're going after Ms. DuPont?" Her mother closed the laptop. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." "But it's because of me," Nova whispered. "I started it." Her mother cupped her face. "No, honey, they started it. You just didn't back down." 2 days later, they flew to Washington, D.C. This time there was no coach, no stewardess looking her up and down, no tension in the air. Because Henrietta had chartered a private jet for her and 5 other kids, all under 12, who had also submitted formal complaints to the FAA in the last 2 years. Nova sat beside a boy named Davion who said, "I didn't know we were allowed to talk back to grown-ups on planes." Nova smiled. "We're not," she whispered, "but sometimes you do it anyway." In D.C., they didn't go to the Capitol. They went to something quieter. A federal ethics boardroom on the 14th floor of the Department of Transportation. It smelled like old coffee and new fear. Because sitting at the end of the table was a man Nova recognized from the news. Mitchell Reese, Liberty Sky's chief operating officer. He didn't smile when the kids walked in. In fact, he barely looked up. Henrietta sat at the head of the table, calm, composed, unbothered. "This is Nova Green," she said clearly. "She's not here for your approval." Reese cleared his throat. "Ms. DuPont, this is highly irregular." "No. What's irregular is that your crew called the police on a 10-year-old girl because they didn't believe her boarding pass." "She had no photo ID," Reese replied. "She had a confirmation number. That's legally sufficient under federal guidelines for a minor." "We followed protocol." "Then your protocol is broken," Henrietta said sharply. "And now it's costing you more than ethics points." Nova watched the exchange in silence. Then she raised her hand. Henrietta turned. "Yes, Nova?" Nova looked at Mr. Reese. "Do you think I didn't belong there?" He hesitated. "I think the situation was misunderstood." Nova didn't blink. "You didn't answer my question." The room went silent. Even the lawyer stopped typing. Reese shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about belonging." Nova set her sketchbook on the table and opened to the first page. It showed a rough pencil drawing of a first-class cabin, seat 1A. A girl sitting alone, legs swinging. Below it, she'd written in big block letters, "If you earn the seat, you deserve to sit there." Henrietta didn't say a word. She just let the drawing sit in the air like a verdict. By the end of that meeting, Liberty Sky's ethics score was dropped to non-compliant across 3 international audit systems. 3 partner banks suspended $80 in revolving credit lines. 9 airports announced temporary boarding restrictions. The CEO issued a public apology. Mitchell Reese quietly resigned. Nova didn't understand all of it, but she understood one thing. They didn't call her a liar this time. That night, back at the hotel, Nova sat on the balcony eating a grilled cheese sandwich. Henrietta joined her, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Can I ask you something?" Nova said. "Of course." "Why'd you help me?" Henrietta sipped her drink. "Because someone helped me once, and I didn't want to waste that gift." Nova looked down. "It still doesn't feel real." Henrietta smiled. "That's because real power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers." Later that week, the FAA formally adopted the Nova Green Protocol into federal aviation law, marking the first time in U.S. history that a child's experience directly reshaped an industry-wide ethical standard. It wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about a shift. One that started with a girl who stayed quiet while the world tried to make her invisible, and who proved, without raising her voice, that dignity doesn't need permission. They called it the protocol that shook the skies. News anchors used big words like precedent, reform, and unprecedented accountability. But Nova Green, sitting in her mom's lap with a blanket over her shoulders, didn't care about the headlines. She only cared that now, when she looked at a plane, she didn't feel afraid. The day the Nova Green Protocol went into effect, Henrietta DuPont vanished from the public spotlight. No press conference, no victory speech, no social media victory lap. Just gone. But not to Nova. A week later, a letter came. In gold-embossed stationery, no sender listed. Inside, "There's something I want you to see before the world forgets how this started." Henrietta attached was a first-class boarding pass, seat 1A, and a handwritten address in Hudson Valley, New York. They flew the next morning. The car that picked them up was old-fashioned, all black, no logo, no chauffeur badge. The driver said nothing, just nodded and drove. After 2 hours of winding through tree-lined roads, they arrived at a stone estate with ivy-covered walls and a brass plaque at the gate. The Dignity Archive, private holdings, action. By invitation only. Nova blinked. "Mom, what is this place?" Her mother stared out the window. "I don't know. But if Henrietta sent that invitation, it means she wants you to see something." Inside was nothing like Nova expected. No museum glass, no velvet ropes, no security guards, just a library. Long, quiet, sacred. Each shelf had thick volumes, labeled only by initials and years. Henrietta was waiting near the fireplace. Same coat, same quiet power. "You came," she said softly. Nova nodded. "What is this place?" Henrietta walked over to a leather-bound book and opened it. Inside was a photo of a black woman, maybe in her late 20s, in a pilot's uniform from the 1960s. "This," Henrietta said, "was my mother." Nova looked closer. The woman was saluting, her eyes serious, her stance unshaken. "She was denied entry to the cockpit on 72 flights," Henrietta continued. "Not because she wasn't qualified, but because they said passengers would be uncomfortable with a woman, especially a black one, flying the plane." Nova clenched her jaw. "That's unfair." Henrietta smiled faintly. "Yes, and it was never corrected. Until now." She closed the book. "This place is for those stories, the ones they don't put in textbooks." Henrietta led them down a hallway lined with portraits, but not of presidents or tycoons. It was people like Nova, kids, women, elders, activists, whistleblowers. Each one had a plaque beneath it. No fame, no glory, just one line. "They sat anyway." Henrietta stopped at a new frame, still blank. "This will be yours," she said, turning to Nova. Nova stepped back. I'm not like them." Henrietta knelt down. "You didn't have to be. That's what makes it powerful." Later that afternoon, they sat in a quiet room Henrietta called the Records Hall. She handed Nova a small device, like a tablet, but old. "Touch any name," she said. Nova tapped a name. C.A. 1992, the screen lit up with a video. A young girl, no older than Nova, was being escorted off a plane in cuffs. Her only crime? Speaking Creole and being misunderstood. Another name. E.S. 2004. An elderly man denied a seat upgrade he had paid for because the attendant thought his walker was clunky and unprofessional. Nova stared. "How come nobody ever talks about this?" Henrietta didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Because people forget what doesn't affect them, and this archive exists so we never forget again." When they returned to the main room, something had changed. Henrietta was sitting straighter, her hands folded tighter, her voice quieter, almost vulnerable. "I need to tell you something," she said to Nova's mother. "But Nova should hear it too." Her mother hesitated. "Is this about the airline's lawsuit?" "No, it's about my health." The room went still. Nova's breath caught in her chest. "I'm retiring," Henrietta said. "Soon." Nova's mother leaned forward. "Henrietta." But she raised a hand. "I've made peace with it. My time is ending, but what we built here, it's just beginning." She turned to Nova. "That's why I brought you here. Not for closure, for continuity." The next day, before they left, Henrietta handed Nova a plain envelope. Inside was a pass card with gold trim. On the back, a single line. "Archive key. User N. Green." Henrietta bent down. "You now have full access. When you're ready, you'll know what to do with it." Nova looked up at her. "You really think I can keep this going?" Henrietta touched her chin gently. "You didn't just survive injustice. You transformed it." The car pulled away down the quiet road. Nova looked out the window, the card clutched in her hand. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew this. There would always be kids like her, and now they had a place that remembered them, a place that refused to let silence win. 6 weeks later, Nova found herself in the back seat of another black sedan. This one wasn't heading to a secret archive or some hidden estate. This one was headed straight for Capitol Hill. The invitation came unexpectedly. It was stamped with the seal of the Senate Committee on Transportation and Ethics. Inside, it read, "Ms. Nova Green is requested to speak, not as a victim, but as a catalyst." Office of Senator Colleen Miles. Nova had stared at the letter for 10 minutes before whispering to her mom, "Does this mean they actually listened?" Washington was loud, busier than before. Reporters crowded every gate. Cameras flashed as soon as they spotted her, but Nova walked straight through. Chin high, eyes steady. Henrietta had taught her that. "Walk like your presence is already the answer," she'd said once. Inside the Senate building, the marble floors echoed every footstep. Nova wore a navy blue blazer, not because anyone told her to, but because it reminded her of that Lego pilot she once built. The one who flew the plane no one thought she could. The hearing room was full. Senators, advisors, journalists, airline lobbyists, even a few flight attendants in uniform, nervously whispering among themselves. In the front row sat 6 children, all under 12, kids like Nova who had filed mistreatment claims through the passenger ethics registry after her story went public. One boy waved at her. Nova waved back. Senator Miles tapped the microphone. "We're here today to discuss the adoption of the Passenger Dignity Charter, a federal guideline for minimum ethical treatment of minor passengers on domestic and international flights." She paused. "But before we debate the law, we must first remember the child who made us rethink the system." She nodded toward Nova. "Ms. Green, the floor is yours." Nova stood. For a moment, all she could hear was her heartbeat. Then she took a deep breath, looked at the senators, and began. "My name is Nova Green. I'm 10 years old, and I used to think being quiet made me safe." She paused, eyes scanning the room. "But it didn't. When I stayed quiet on that plane, I still got dragged off. I still got treated like I didn't belong, like I was a problem." Murmurs. She continued. "And when I finally got the courage to ask why, the answer I got was a security guard in my face, a phone call to my mom saying I was unaccompanied, and a crowd staring like I was dangerous." More murmurs. The tension thickened. Nova didn't flinch. "But then someone believed me," she said softly. "Someone named Henrietta DuPont." Gasps. Everyone knew that name now. "She taught me that rules are only fair when they protect people who don't have power. She showed me that silence doesn't fix anything. It just hides the truth longer." Nova opened a folder and handed the clerk a document. "This is the draft I worked on with Henrietta before she passed. We call it the Ethics Blueprint. It outlines 7 simple protections for minor passengers. I think you already have it in your binders." Some senators nodded. Some flipped papers quickly. Nova folded her hands. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to offer a better way." The next 45 minutes blurred together. Questions. Follow-ups. One senator asked her how she defined dignity. Nova answered, "It's when people don't make you prove you matter." A woman in the audience teared up. Another asked what she thought justice looked like for kids. "It looks like not being scared to fly again." By the end of the hearing, something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the way people looked at her. They didn't see her as a story anymore. They saw her as a standard. That afternoon, news broke. 19 out of 22 major airports pledged to adopt the Nova Protocol as baseline policy. 3 major airlines announced internal reforms. The FAA confirmed it would integrate the Passenger Dignity Charter into federal review checklists. But that wasn't the most powerful moment of the day. That came later, when Nova and her mom walked out of the Senate building. Standing at the bottom of the steps was a woman holding her son's hand. He couldn't have been more than 6. She looked nervous, but smiled as Nova approached. "Are you Nova?" she asked softly. Nova nodded. The woman bent down to her son. "Go ahead, baby." The boy looked up at Nova. "I sat in front yesterday. No one made me move." He held out a small Lego girl with a pilot cap. "She looks like you." Nova felt tears sting her eyes. She knelt down and whispered, "She looks like you too." That night, Nova lay in bed back at the hotel, the day playing like a movie in her head. The hearing, the applause, the kid on the steps. She reached into her bag and pulled out Henrietta's card, the one that gave her archive access. She turned it over. On the back, Someone had written a second line in new ink. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you start. Nova smiled, and for the first time since that awful flight, she felt like she was finally where she belonged. They thought she'd be easy to ignore. Just a 10-year-old girl with a microphone. Just a single story. Just a fleeting headline. But by week 3, after the Senate hearing, Nova Green's name wasn't fading. It was echoing. And not everyone liked that. Inside the glossy boardroom of Sky Nova Airlines, things were unraveling. Behind the smiles and PR tweets, tension sizzled like a frayed wire. CEO Clint Harwood slammed a folder shut. "This girl has done more damage to our brand than any boycott in 10 years, he snapped. His legal counsel, Denise, kept her face calm. Her stories touched a nerve, and people are choosing sides. Clint leaned forward, eyes cold. "So what's the play? A settlement? Silence her with charity?" Denise shook her head. "She doesn't want money, Clint. She wants change. That's the problem." What Clint didn't know, or refused to believe, was that change had already begun. Airlines were scrambling. Pilots whispered about new accountability systems. Flight crews were quietly circulating petitions asking for ethics training tied to passenger dignity scores. Even Sky Nova's own flight attendants had begun pushing back, some anonymously, others openly. Jessica Lynn, a senior flight attendant for Sky Nova, was one of the first to step up. She remembered that day Nova got pulled off the flight. She wasn't on duty, but she'd seen the footage, and she never forgot the silence in the girl's eyes. A week after Nova's hearing, Jessica walked into a staff meeting and placed a USB drive on the table. "What's this?" asked the operations director. Jessica didn't blink. "All my incident reports from the last 4 years, the ones that were buried or ignored, patterns of racial bias, misuse of policy, passenger profiling." There was a long silence. "Why now?" someone asked. Jessica looked them in the eye. "Because Nova had the guts to stand alone. I don't." Meanwhile, inside Nova's world, things didn't feel like victory. They felt heavy. School had become weird. Some kids whispered celebrity under their breath. Others avoided her. Her mom tried to act normal, but Nova saw the stress behind her smile. The reporters camping outside, the inbox full of opportunities, the lawyers offering to guide the brand. Nova didn't want to be a brand. She just wanted things to change. Then, one night, Henrietta's voice came back to her, not literally, but in memory. When people start pushing back, that's when the real work begins. Nova pulled out her tablet and opened the archive access. A message blinked on screen. One new submission. J. Lin 01. Internal docs enclosed. Nova opened the file. As she read Jessica Lynn's whistleblower report, her throat tightened. Names, incidents, timelines. Almost all marked no action taken. It wasn't just a few cases. It was a pattern, a system. And now, Nova had proof. The next morning, she emailed the Senate subcommittee. "There's something you need to see. It's bigger than just my story now." 2 days later, Senator Miles called an emergency ethics review session. But this time, Nova wasn't testifying alone. Jessica Lynn sat beside her. So did a second whistleblower, a reservation clerk named Arturo. Between them, they painted a picture of an entire airline network trained not to protect passengers, but to protect the airline from passengers. The public response was swift and seismic. 3 airlines, including Sky Nova, were hit with federal review orders. FAA announced a suspension of route expansions pending full ethics audits. Whistleblower protections for flight crews were extended to gate agents and contractors. And Nova? She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply said, "It's a start." But behind closed doors, Sky Nova wasn't done. Clint Harwood launched an internal campaign to discredit Jessica. Leaked memos, smear articles. They even tried to paint Nova's family as privileged manipulators, exploiting tragedy for fame. It backfired, hard, because Jessica had kept everything. Voice recordings, paper trails, deleted emails, And she wasn't alone anymore. Dozens of former employees came forward, armed with documents, video, and screenshots of buried ethics complaints. And Nova? She made sure every one of them had a place to speak. The archive team, now working under a new nonprofit called The Dignity Project, began compiling all cases into a digital exposé titled Beneath the Wings, The Ethics They Hid. Within 48 hours of release, it had 2.1 million views and was translated into 11 languages. Jessica texted Nova the night it dropped. "You started a fire, and it's lighting up the dark." Nova stared at the message for a while before replying, "No, you lit the match. I just refused to blow it out." By the end of the month, Sky Nova's board forced Clint Harwood to step down. He resigned for personal reasons. But everyone knew the real reason: Nova, Jessica, and the system that could no longer be silenced. At a small press event days later, Senator Miles introduced the next phase of the Passenger Dignity Charter. Every airline must now undergo quarterly ethics audits and publish a passenger dignity report accessible to the public. At her side stood Nova and Jessica, not as guests, but as authors of the policy. Later, walking down the steps of the Senate building again, Nova looked up at Jessica. "Were you ever scared?" she asked. Jessica smiled faintly. "All the time. Still am." "So, why'd you do it?" Jessica looked out over the crowd of reporters and cameras. "Because the silence was worse." Nova nodded slowly. "I think I understand now." Jessica looked down at her. "No, Nova, you taught us how." The house was too quiet that morning. Nova sat at the kitchen table, her fingers resting lightly on a letter, still sealed, with Henrietta's handwriting across the front. "To Nova, when you're ready." It had arrived 2 weeks after the Senate hearing. No fanfare, no explanation, just the envelope, and Nova's name in that elegant looping cursive. She hadn't opened it right away. Part of her was scared too. Scared it would be a goodbye she wasn't ready for. Scared it would make the loss feel real. But today felt different. Outside, a soft breeze rustled the garden. Her mom had taken a call on the porch, leaving Nova alone with her thoughts and the letter. She peeled it open slowly. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, folded once, and a key. "Dear Nova, if you're reading this, it means you did it. You didn't just speak up, you stood up. And you didn't just stand up, you led. I always knew you would. Not because of who you are, but because of how you see. You see people others overlook. You notice silence. You respect stillness. That's rare. You probably have questions. Why me? Why now? Why this whole archive thing? Here's the truth. You weren't just a spark. You were the plan. The archive was never meant to be a secret forever. It was meant to wait. For someone honest enough to care and brave enough not to stop. The key inside this letter opens a box in my study. Top drawer, back left. You'll find what's next. And Nova, don't let them make you smaller than your story. Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about remembering what matters and making it real. With all my heart, Henrietta. Nova read the letter 3 times before she moved. Then she slipped the key into her pocket, grabbed her hoodie, and walked quietly down the hallway toward Henrietta's study. She hadn't been inside since Henrietta passed. Everything was still, untouched. Nova walked to the mahogany desk, opened the top left drawer, and reached into the very back. Her fingers found cold metal, a small black lockbox. She used the key. It clicked open with a soft snap. Inside were 3 things. A leather-bound notebook labeled The Flight Journal, a faded photo of a younger Henrietta, standing in front of a hangar, smiling beside 2 children. A USB drive with a silver tag. AerEthica Core, Autumn Protocol 06. Nova sat down slowly and opened the journal first. The first page hit like lightning. What if airline ethics weren't just reactive, but predictive? Henrietta had outlined an entire system, one that could track and prevent discrimination patterns in real time. Not just complaints, but behavior signals, language markers, even escalation risks. It was like a flight control tower for human dignity. The next 10 pages broke everything down. A Dignity Index score for airlines, updated monthly. A real-time dashboard used by regulators, investors, even the public. A predictive model that could flag passenger vulnerability zones based on seating, crew history, and booking patterns. A code name, AerEthica Core. Nova blinked. She knew what this was. This wasn't just a proposal. It was a finished system, and Henrietta had passed her the controls. She plugged in the USB drive to her tablet. A password prompt flashed, then a biometric scan. Nova hesitated, then used her thumb. Green light. The screen opened to a glowing dashboard, already live. Airline names, airport hubs, live ratings, and a message blinking at the bottom. Welcome, Nova Green. Ethics Protocol 06 now active. Nova stared. It was real. And it was hers now. For a moment, she just sat there, heart thudding, breath shallow. Then the weight hit her. This was more than a mission. It was a responsibility. She spent the next 5 hours reading everything in the notebook, cross-checking with the system, running mock scenarios. By dinner time, Nova had a plan. She didn't tell anyone right away, not even her mom. Some stories don't need announcements. They need action. The next morning, she contacted Senator Miles again. This time, she brought not just a vision, but a functioning ethics system ready to be tested across 3 major airports. Within 72 hours, AerEthica Core was installed in pilot mode at JFK International, Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, LAX in Los Angeles. Initial results came in fast. By the end of the first week, 6 crew members were flagged for retraining based on behavior signals. 2 gate reassignment cases were reversed in real time. Passenger satisfaction in vulnerable groups rose by 41%. One attempted racial profiling incident was stopped at the gate. The FAA called it a breakthrough in ethics tech. The media dubbed it the Nova Grid. But Nova didn't care about names. She cared about outcomes. She sent a single email to all airline CEOs. We don't need more apologies. We need more prevention. AerEthica is open for you, but only if you're ready to be seen. Within a week, 4 airlines signed up voluntarily. SkyNova wasn't one of them. Nova didn't push. She knew the system would outlast resistance. That night, Nova sat on the back porch with her mom. The stars were out. The wind was soft. Her mom looked over and asked quietly, "Are you okay?" Nova nodded. "I'm not trying to fix everything," she said. "Just make it harder to break." Her mom smiled gently. "You already did." And in a quiet archive room far away, Henrietta's old monitor lit up one last time. The dashboard showed 38 airlines, live data, real impact. At the top, a banner blinked in soft blue. Protocol 06, operational, in honor of Nova Green. By now, the world knew Nova Green's name, but not everyone was clapping. Inside SkyNova's executive wing, past the glass doors, under the shimmering chandelier, a war room had formed. CEO Clint Harwood was gone, but that didn't mean the company had turned a corner. In fact, it was digging in. Deep. Greg Sullivan, SkyNova's new interim CEO, stood at the head of the table, late 50s, Harvard-educated, and polished like a blade. "We've lost the media battle," he admitted, tapping his finger against the screen showing news headlines praising Nova. "But we haven't lost control. Not yet." A woman to his left, legal counsel from a crisis firm, leaned in. "We do have one advantage. She's still a child. Legally, we can position this as overreach, a juvenile leading tech ethics. We can spin that." Greg smiled. "And we will." But across town, in a quiet co-working space in Lower Manhattan, Nova sat surrounded by people twice her age, all listening to her. Tech leaders, civil rights organizers, FAA advisors. They weren't there for a photo op. They were there because Nova had built something no one else had, a system that made bias visible, and actionable in real time. At the front of the table, she clicked a remote. The screen behind her lit up. AerEthica Core, 3-week review. Nova took a breath. We've logged 143 flagged incidents. 92 of them confirmed crew behavior issues. 11 led to real-time intervention. We're not perfect, but we're proving what's possible. Someone asked, "What about Sky Nova?" Nova didn't flinch. They're refusing access, but the public pressure is building, and we have whistleblowers on our side. That made the room go quiet. Then a voice spoke from the back. "I have something you need to see." It was Arturo, the reservation clerk who had testified with Jessica Lynn. But this time, he wasn't holding stories. He was holding proof. He slid a flash drive across the table. "I stayed on a few weeks after the hearing. I wanted to know if they were cleaning house or hiding the dirt." Nova plugged the drive into the laptop. Files opened. Internal memos. Call center transcripts. Secret policies. Her breath caught. One file was titled, "Passenger Evaluation Matrix, Red Tier Triggers." It was a list of flags, not for safety threats, but for passenger types. Unaccompanied minors from underserved ZEP codes. Passengers with dual language support requests. Frequent flyer mismatch with attire, class. Ethnicity-coded behavior escalation markers. Nova stared at the screen in horror. "They were profiling children," Arturo nodded. "And poor people, non-native English speakers, anyone who didn't fit their brand aesthetic." By the time Nova left the meeting, the fire inside her had turned white hot. Not rage, not revenge, resolve. That night, she sat in her bedroom, rereading Henrietta's letter. Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about remembering what matters and making it real. Nova knew what mattered now. It wasn't just exposure, it was escalation. The next morning, she called a press conference. Not the typical kind. This one was live-streamed across 3 platforms, hosted inside a public library, and open to anyone, especially former airline employees who wanted to speak. They called it Voices Below the Wings. And it exploded. Over 1.4 million people watched live. One by one, ex-flight attendants, ticket agents, even cleaning staff came forward. Some told stories, others brought emails. A few brought tears. And then came the bombshell. Jessica Lynn took the podium again, but this time she brought a contract. A Sky Nova executive-level NDA, signed and time-stamped, instructing managerial staff to minimize escalation for high-value complaints and reframe all bias-based complaints as operational misunderstandings unless verified by security footage. Jessica looked straight into the camera. "That's why we're here. Because unless we're caught on camera, we don't matter." Nova stood beside her. "And that ends now." 2 hours later, #Voices Below. The Wings was trending in 11 countries. By evening, 3 things happened. FAA announced a formal ethics breach investigation into Sky Nova. Congress scheduled a new hearing on airline accountability and AI-based profiling. Nova received a call from someone she never expected. Lillian Mercer, chairwoman of the United Airlines Regulatory Alliance, the largest private coalition of airlines in North America. "Nova," she said over the speakerphone, "we believe it's time the entire industry takes responsibility. Would you be willing to lead an independent audit coalition?" Nova was silent for a moment. Then, "Only if the data is public. No exceptions." Lillian chuckled softly. "You remind me of someone I used to fear in boardrooms. Her name was Henrietta." Nova smiled. "She's the reason I'm still standing." That same week, AerEthica Core was adopted by 6 new airlines. Nova personally handed off the activation codes. At JFK Terminal 4, a new sign was installed above the customer service booth. "This airline is monitored for dignity and passenger ethics in real time, powered by AerEthica." A little boy stopped and asked his dad what it meant. The father smiled, looked down at his son, then up at the logo. "It means they're finally watching the right people." But while Nova's movement was gaining ground, the old systems weren't done fighting. Back at Sky Nova, Greg Sullivan had a new plan. He called it Echo Flood. A coordinated campaign of fake social media posts, anonymous, concerned parent letters, and planted op-eds, all questioning Nova's credibility. Too much power for a child. She's being coached by radicals. She's just a tool. It spread fast. But something happened that Greg didn't expect. People didn't buy it, not this time. Because Nova had never claimed to be a hero. She had just shared the truth. And in a world tired of excuses, truth was harder to silence than ever. Still, the attacks took a toll. Nova logged off social media for 3 days. She spent time in the garden, with her mom, with Henrietta's old journal. She didn't say much, but when she came back online, she posted one line: "I am not the story, we are." And the world responded, hard. Airline stockholders began demanding ethics audits. Consumer groups formed to push for legislation. And Nova? She received a sealed envelope. No name, no return address. Inside was a single card. "What you've started will take years. But for the first time in decades, we believe again. Keep going." It was signed, "Former FAA Deputy Commissioner, retired." By the end of the month, the U.S. Department of Transportation held its first Passenger Dignity Summit. Nova was the closing speaker. She stepped up to the podium, not in a blazer or dress, but in her usual jeans and hoodie, and said, "I don't have fancy credentials. I'm not running for office. I'm a 10-year-old girl who saw what people pretended not to. And I built a way to make sure it can't be ignored again. That's all this is, seeing each other loudly." The room stood for a full minute after she finished. Not in applause, in respect. 10 months later, Nova Green stood alone on a sky bridge in San Francisco International Airport, watching a plane taxi toward the gate. It wasn't just any flight. It was the last Sky Nova aircraft to land under its original name. At midnight, the rebrand would go live. By morning, the world would know it as something new, something better. Fair Winds Air. The transformation wasn't cosmetic. It wasn't about a new logo or flight attendant uniforms. It was about what Nova had forced into motion, from a torn boarding pass to a federal reckoning. A year ago, she was just a girl trying to get home. Now, she was a name on legislation, a blueprint author, and the youngest recipient of the Civil Rights Impact Award. But tonight, standing alone, Nova didn't feel powerful. She just felt quiet. Her mom's voice came through the phone. "You okay, baby?" Nova nodded, even though her mom couldn't see it. "Yeah, just remembering." There was a pause. "You made something impossible happen, Nova. That's worth remembering." She hung up and walked toward Gate 14B. There was a new sign beside the gate. "This airline complies with the Passenger Ethics Charter, monitored by AerEthica." Underneath was a quote in small type. Nova had written it herself. "Dignity is the right to fly without shrinking yourself." Inside the gate, people were boarding calmly. No raised voices, no standoffs, no children crying in corners while adults judged them. Just normal. That was the miracle. Suddenly, Nova heard a familiar voice. "Ms. Green?" She turned. A woman in a navy jumpsuit stood there holding a clipboard. "I work for the Department of Transportation. We're doing spot audits. Just wanted to say, thank you. She gestured around. "This is because of you." Nova smiled, a little awkward. "It's not just me. It's everyone who spoke up. Everyone who got dragged off or humiliated and kept going anyway." The woman nodded. "Still, you turned a boarding pass into a bill. That's legacy." Later that night, Nova sat at a quiet table in the airport cafe, scribbling in her journal. She flipped back to the first page. It still had the sticker Henrietta gave her, a paper airplane made of gold foil. Next to it, she wrote, "Flight 1N23 wasn't the worst day of my life. It was the day I found my voice." Across the country, news anchors reported that Sky Nova's stock had rebounded, not because it buried scandal, but because it embraced reform. In fact, Fair Winds Air had now partnered with 4 ethics startups, committed $42 million to underserved travel communities, and pledged permanent ethics training for all crew, reviewed quarterly by AerEthica. And yet, Nova still refused to fly first class. "It's not about the seat," she told a journalist once. "It's about what happens when people think you don't belong in it." One final moment capped her night. Just before boarding her flight home, a little girl, maybe 7, ran up and tugged her sleeve. "Are you Nova?" Nova crouched down. "Yeah. Who are you?" "I'm Naomi. I brought my own notebook just like yours." She held up a tiny journal covered in purple glitter. Nova smiled. "You gonna write something brave in it?" Naomi nodded hard. "Today I sat in 2A. Nobody said anything bad, not even a look." She reached into her backpack and gave Nova a folded paper. It was a drawing, Nova, with a cape, and underneath it read, "She made them land so we could rise." Nova choked back a tear and hugged the girl. "Thank you. That's the best award I've ever gotten." When Nova's flight took off, she stared out the window. Below her, the lights of the city shimmered like circuits in a giant motherboard. And somewhere far beneath them was a gate, a hallway, a broken system that would never be the same again. Because a quiet little girl didn't stay quiet. Because Henrietta believed. Because Jessica stood up. Because truth spread faster than lies when you gave it wings. And because Nova Green didn't just fly that day, she grounded an empire. A week after the rebrand, Nova received a large brown envelope. No return address, no stamps. Just a handwritten label, to Nova Green, for the quiet days ahead. Inside were dozens of letters, real ones, written in pen and pencil, crayon and Sharpie, some on notebook paper, some on hotel stationery. One was written on the back of a Sky Nova napkin. Every single one had come from someone she had never met. The first one read, "I was duct taped to my seat when I was 9 because I cried during takeoff. I never flew again, until last week. Thank you for making it safe for kids like me." Another, "My mother worked check-in for 22 years. She used to say, 'Some people fly above the rules.' After the hearing, she finally believed someone could pull them back down." And then one from a name she did recognize, Jessica Lynn. "Nova, there are 2 kinds of courage. The kind that roars in courtrooms, and the kind that stays soft even when people try to break it. You did both, and you never changed your voice for anyone. Keep it that way." Jessica. Nova read them all sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by envelopes. Her mom snapped a picture, not to post, just to remember, because something had shifted. This wasn't about the scandal anymore. This was about legacy. 2 days later, Nova was invited to speak at a middle school in DC. Not at a policy summit, not a tech panel, just a school gym filled with kids in mismatched mad sneakers and oversized backpacks. Her kind of crowd. A boy raised his hand first. "Did you ever want to quit?" Nova grinned. "All the time. But then I'd remember what quitting meant. That someone else like me might have to go through it too, and I wasn't okay with that." A girl followed up. "Are you famous now?" Nova laughed. "I don't know. Ask my grandma. She still calls me every morning just to ask if I brushed my teeth." The gym burst into laughter. But then a final question came from the quietest voice in the room. It wasn't a question, actually. It was a statement. "My brother got dragged off a plane because he's autistic and couldn't say his seat number. They said he was being uncooperative. He hasn't spoken since." Silence swept through the room. Nova walked over. She knelt in front of the girl and took her hand. "I'm sorry that happened," she said, "and I promise, we're building a system now that sees people like your brother, not erases them." The girl nodded slowly, and for the first time all morning, she smiled. That night, Nova added something to the AerEthica roadmap. Non-verbal passenger interface, development priority, high. Because stories weren't just fuel, they were blueprints. As Nova's work expanded, she kept one wall in her bedroom just for letters. Not awards, not certificates. Letters. Paper truths in messy handwriting. They reminded her why she began. One letter had no name, just a quote. "The wings we build for others will carry us further than our own." It was taped above her bed. She read it every night. By the end of the month, 5 more airlines joined AerEthica. Nova didn't send press releases. She just sent welcome kits. Each one had 3 things: a handwritten note, a copy of the passenger dignity protocol, a gold foil paper airplane, just like the one Henrietta gave her. The world was changing. Not overnight, but flight by flight, letter by letter. And at the center of it all was a girl who had every reason to scream, but chose to build something quieter and stronger. They tried to make her small. When they tore her boarding pass, when they called a cop on a 10-year-old in first class, when they told her she didn't belong. But Nova Green never shrank. She didn't yell. She didn't fight back with fists. She fought with focus, with truth, with persistence so steady it scared the powerful. Today, Nova stood on a TED stage in Vancouver. The audience was silent as her photo appeared behind her. That grainy cell phone image from Gate 14B, a small girl clutching a torn pass, 2 officers looming overhead. Nova looked at it for a moment, then turned back to the crowd. "I used to think dignity meant being polite," she began. "But it's not. Dignity means refusing to disappear, even when someone powerful tells you to." The room leaned in, not because she raised her voice. She never did. But because they could feel the weight behind her words. Nova told the story without embellishment. The tear, the escort, the silence on the plane. The moment she looked at Henrietta and understood. This wasn't just about her. She spoke of ethics audits, of airports freezing contracts, of AerEthica's first year and the 21 airlines now under its compliance. But then she paused. "This isn't a story about money or lawsuits," she said. "It's a story about what happens when a child chooses not to shrink." A few people in the front row wiped their eyes. Others sat still, their faces unreadable, but clearly moved. "I wasn't the loudest voice in the room," Nova continued. "I wasn't even supposed to be in the room, but I stayed." And the room changed. The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause, not out of pity, not even admiration, out of recognition, because they knew, in some way, they'd shrunk before too, and now they wouldn't. After the talk, a little boy approached Nova backstage. He had vitiligo on his face and wore thick glasses. "You made me feel brave," he whispered. Nova smiled and knelt. "You already were. You just needed a mirror." That night, Nova walked back to her hotel with her mom. They passed by a newsstand where a magazine cover showed her face, the caption reading, "The Girl Who Grounded Giants." She shook her head, half laughing. "They make it sound like I crashed a plane." Her mom smiled. "You didn't crash it, baby. You just made sure the next one flies fair." As they rode the elevator up, Nova leaned against her mom's shoulder. "I don't want to be famous," she murmured. "You're not," her mom said. "You're just necessary." Back in her room, Nova looked out the window, the city glittering like it was lit from below. Somewhere, a little girl was boarding her first flight, holding her seat confidently, being seen, being safe. And Nova knew she didn't just change one flight. She changed what flight means, forever. Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, just because of how you looked, how young you were, or where you sat? Tell us your story in the comments, because stories like yours deserve to be heard. And let us know where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you think.